Welcome to the Sleepy Bat. Tonight we're stepping into the harsh and unpolished world of medieval knights, far from the fairy tales of shining armor and noble quests. Forget Hollywood's version of honor and glory. The truth? Being a knight was a life of pain, grime, and survival, where every day tested your body and spirit. So grab your pillow, find a comfortable spot, and let's journey back to a time when knighthood wasn't about rescuing princesses. Imagine it's the year 129. You're 7 years old, and instead of playing with friends or learning to read, you've just been sent away from home, ripped from your family to begin the long, brutal path to knighthood. They call you a page, but really you're a servant, waking before sunrise, scrubbing armor until your hands crack, tending animals that outweigh you tenfold. Every mistake earns punishment, every sign of hesitation, a mark against your future. If you make it through, you'll train as a squire, learning to fight, to obey, and to kill. Your armor? 60 pounds of burning steel in summer. Your battles? Not elegant duels, but muddy, frantic chaos where survival depends more on luck than valor. And if you fail, there's no second chance, no family to take you back, just a road leading to poverty. Or worse, the psychological trauma of this system was intentional. They were breaking down children and rebuilding them as warriors who could function in a world of unimaginable violence. Modern psychologists would recognize this as systematic abuse, but in medieval times it was just Tuesday. Imagine this. You're just 14. Your hands are raw, your back aches. You haven't seen your family in years. They call you a squire now, no longer a page. But that doesn't mean freedom. It means more pain, more fear. Each morning you lift a sword heavier than your arm and swing it again and again until you can't feel your fingers. Your shoulders burn, your legs tremble, and the armor digs into your skin like it wants to swallow you whole. Then come the lessons they don't speak of, the part where you're told to watch. A thief whipped, a traitor hanged, a man drawn and quartered while the crowd cheers. You try not to cry, you try not to feel, because feeling is weakness, and weakness gets you cast out, or worse, it gets you sent to war before you're ready. The weapons training alone was designed to turn you into something barely human. You'd practice cutting through pig carcasses, learning exactly how much force it took to cleave through bone and muscle. You'd train with maces, learning to crush skulls with surgical precision. And all of this was considered normal childhood development for the nobility. But even if you excelled at all this training, even if you proved you could handle the violence and the psychological pressure, you still weren't guaranteed to become a knight. The final step was the most dangerous of all, and it's where many would-be knights met their end before they ever earned their spurs. The transition from squire to knight wasn't marked by a ceremony or a test. It was earned in actual combat where you had to prove your worth while people were actively trying to kill you. Many squires died in their first real battle, cut down before they could demonstrate their skills. Others were captured and held for ransom, spending years in dungeons that made modern prisons look like luxury hotels. And here's something that will really mess with your head. The romantic idea of knights fighting for honor and glory? Complete fiction. Knights fought for land, for money, for political advantage. Honor was a luxury they couldn't afford when faced with an enemy trying to cave in their skull with a warhammer. The reality of medieval combat was nothing like the choreographed sword fights you see in movies. It was chaos, pure and simple. Imagine being trapped inside a metal can while dozens of people try to kill you with sharp objects. You can barely see through your helmet's visor. You can't hear orders over the screaming and clashing of metal, and every breath you take tastes like blood and sweat. Knights didn't engage in noble single combat. They fought in massive melees where you were as likely to be killed by someone on your own side as by the enemy. Friendly fire wasn't just common, it was expected. In the heat of battle with limited visibility and adrenaline pumping, knights regularly killed their own allies by mistake. The weapons designed to kill knights were absolutely terrifying. Warhammers that could crush armor like tin cans, crossbow bolts that could punch through steel plate, and my personal nightmare fuel, the rondel dagger specifically designed to slip between armor joints and find the soft flesh beneath. These weren't weapons of honor, they were tools of murder, plain and simple. But perhaps the most shocking thing about knightly combat was how it usually ended. Not with a clean death in glorious battle, but with slow, agonizing wounds that festered for weeks. Medieval medicine was primitive at best, and armor actually made treating wounds more difficult. Knights who survived battles often died days or weeks later from infections that modern antibiotics could cure in hours. And let's talk about what happened when knights were defeated but not killed. Capture meant ransom, and ransom meant months or years of imprisonment in conditions that would violate every human rights convention ever written. Knights were valuable alive, so enemies would keep them in barely habitable dungeons, feeding them just enough to keep them breathing while negotiating payment for their release. The psychological toll of this lifestyle was staggering. Modern soldiers deal with PTSD after single deployments, but knights lived with constant violence for their entire adult lives. They watched friends die horribly, they killed other human beings with their own hands, and they lived every day knowing that tomorrow might be their last. This constant exposure to death and violence created a warrior class that was fundamentally broken. Knights drank heavily, they were prone to explosive violence even in peacetime, and they struggled to form normal human relationships. The very training that made them effective killers also made them unfit for civilized society. But the worst part, society expected them to maintain the facade of chivalry and honor even while they were psychologically shattered. They had to pretend to be noble heroes while dealing with what we now recognize as severe trauma and mental illness. The code of chivalry that supposedly governed knightly behavior was mostly propaganda, designed to make the brutal reality of medieval warfare seem noble and righteous. In practice, knights raped, pillaged, and murdered with impunity, then attended church on Sunday and pretended to be servants of God. And speaking of God, the church played a massive role in perpetuating the myth of knightly honor while simultaneously blessing the very violence that destroyed these men's souls. Priests would bless weapons of war, pray for victory in battle, and then condemn the very violence they had sanctified when it became inconvenient. The economic reality of knighthood was just as brutal as the physical demands. Knights needed enormous amounts of money to maintain their equipment, their horses, and their social status. A single suit of armor cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, and it needed constant maintenance and replacement. This economic pressure drove knights to increasingly desperate measures. They became mercenaries, selling their skills to whoever could pay. They engaged in what was essentially legalized banditry, using their military training to extract wealth from defenseless civilians. The very people they were supposed to protect became their prey, but we're just scratching the surface here. What I've shown you so far is only the beginning of how wrong our modern understanding of medieval knights really is. The daily reality of their lives, the diseases that plagued them, the social pressures that controlled every aspect of their existence, and the shocking truth about how most knights actually died. Well, that's where things get really disturbing. And trust me, you're not prepared for what's coming next. The daily life of a medieval knight was an endless cycle of misery that would break most modern people within a week. Let's start with something as basic as hygiene, because this is where the fantasy really falls apart. Knights didn't bathe regularly, not because they were lazy, but because their lifestyle made it nearly impossible. When you're constantly traveling, fighting, or preparing for battle, finding time and resources for proper hygiene becomes a luxury you can't afford. Most knights went weeks or even months without a proper bath. They'd splash water on their faces, maybe rinse their hands, but full body washing was rare. Now imagine what this meant when you're wearing armor for hours every day. That metal doesn't breathe, and medieval undergarments were basically rags. Knights would marinate in their own sweat, blood, and bodily fluids until their skin developed sores and rashes that never properly healed. The smell was so overwhelming that even other knights who were used to horrific odors would avoid being downwind of their comrades. But it gets worse, much worse. Those romantic feasts you see in movies, the reality was knights eating half-rotten food with unwashed hands, spreading disease among themselves like a medieval petri dish. Food poisoning was so common that many knights just accepted constant stomach problems as part of life. And let's talk about what they were actually eating. When knights were on campaign, which was most of their adult lives, their diet consisted mainly of salted meat that was often spoiled, hard bread that could break your teeth, and whatever they could forage or steal from local populations. Fresh vegetables were almost non-existent, leading to scurvy, rickets, and other nutritional diseases. The water situation was even more nightmarish. Clean drinking water was rare, so knights often drank ale or wine, not for pleasure, but because it was safer than water. This meant they were essentially drunk or hungover most of the time, trying to fight battles and make life or death decisions while their judgment was impaired. Now let's get into the medical horrors that plagued knights throughout their careers. Medieval medicine was a combination of superstition, guesswork, and procedures that were more likely to kill you than cure you. When knights were injured in battle, which happened constantly, they faced a choice between potentially deadly treatment or certain death from infection. Battlefield surgery was performed without anesthesia, antiseptics, or even basic understanding of anatomy. Surgeons would dig around in wounds with dirty hands and unsterilized tools, often causing more damage than the original injury. Many knights died not from their battle wounds but from the infections caused by their own medical treatment. The armor that was supposed to protect knights often became a death sentence when they were wounded. Removing armor from an injured knight was agonizing and time-consuming, and often pieces of metal would be driven into wounds, making treatment even more complicated. Knights would literally be trapped inside their protective gear while they slowly bled to death. But perhaps the most shocking medical reality was how common permanent disabilities were among knights. Broken bones that healed incorrectly, leaving knights with twisted limbs. Eye injuries from weapon strikes that left them partially or completely blind. Joint damage from years of fighting in heavy armor that made simple movement excruciating. The psychological trauma was just as devastating as the physical injuries. Knights suffered from what we now recognize as severe PTSD, but medieval society had no understanding of mental health. Knights who couldn't cope with the constant violence were seen as weak or cowardly, adding shame and social isolation to their existing trauma. Many knights turned to alcohol as their only escape from the psychological pain. Alcoholism was rampant among the warrior class, and drunk knights were notorious for starting fights, destroying property and terrorizing civilians. But society tolerated this behavior because these same men were needed for warfare. The social expectations placed on knights were crushing and contradictory. They were expected to be both brutal killers and gentle courtiers. They had to switch between slaughtering enemies on the battlefield and participating in refined courtly ceremonies. This constant code switching created a kind of psychological whiplash that left many knights feeling like they didn't belong in either world. Knights were also expected to maintain their equipment and appearance despite the brutal conditions they lived in. A knight's armor, weapons, and horse were not just tools of war but symbols of status. Keeping them in good condition required constant attention and significant expense, even when knights were barely surviving themselves. The relationship between knights and their horses reveals another layer of medieval brutality that movies conveniently ignore. War horses weren't noble companions, they were expensive military equipment that needed to be replaced regularly. Horses died in battle constantly, either from enemy weapons or from the sheer physical demands of carrying an armored knight into combat. Knights often went through multiple horses in a single campaign, and each death represented a massive financial loss. Many knights bankrupted themselves trying to maintain their cavalry, leading to desperate measures to acquire new mounts. Horse theft was common among knights, and they would often steal from their own allies if necessary. The training of war horses was almost as brutal as the training of knights themselves. Horses had to be conditioned to charge into lines of armed men, to trample fallen enemies, and to fight alongside their riders. This training involved deliberate exposure to violence and pain, creating animals that were as psychologically damaged as their human partners. But let's talk about something that really drives home how different medieval knighthood was from our modern fantasies. The concept of chivalry, which we think of as the defining characteristic of knights, was actually a late medieval invention designed to clean up the reputation of what was essentially a class of professional thugs. The reality is that for most of the medieval period, knights were indistinguishable from brigands and mercenaries. They lived by violence. They supported themselves through violence, and they saw civilians as resources to be exploited rather than people to be protected. The famous stories of knights rescuing damsels in distress? Pure fiction. In reality, knights were more likely to be the ones putting damsels in distress in the first place. Rape was so common among knights that it was barely considered a crime when the perpetrator was of noble birth. The courtly love tradition that supposedly elevated women to objects of worship was actually a way of controlling and objectifying them. Women in medieval society had no agency in these romantic fantasies. They were prizes to be won, not people with their own desires and choices. Even the famous tournaments that we think of as noble sporting events were originally just training exercises for real warfare. Knights would beat each other senseless with real weapons, and deaths were common. These weren't genteel competitions, they were barely controlled violence designed to keep knights sharp between actual wars. The Church's role in promoting the myth of knightly virtue while simultaneously blessing their violence created a cognitive dissonance that drove many knights to despair. They were told they were servants of God while being trained to commit acts that violated every Christian principle. Many knights developed what we might now recognize as moral injury, a form of psychological trauma that occurs when someone is forced to act against their own moral beliefs. The Church provided no real guidance for dealing with this conflict, instead offering only the promise of forgiveness after death. The economic system that supported knighthood was built on exploitation and violence. Knights extracted wealth from peasants through a combination of taxation, forced labor, and outright theft. The feudal system wasn't a noble arrangement of mutual obligation, it was organized extortion with a fancy name. Knights who couldn't support themselves through their landholdings became mercenaries, selling their skills to whoever could pay. This created a class of professional soldiers with no loyalty except to money, leading to constant warfare as different factions hired knights to fight their battles. The most successful knights weren't the most honorable or skilled, they were the most ruthless and politically savvy. Knights who maintained their moral principles usually ended up dead or destitute, while those who embraced the brutal realities of medieval politics prospered. But here's what really gets me about the myth of knighthood. We've romanticized a system that was fundamentally about control through violence. Knights weren't heroes. They were the enforcers of a social system designed to keep the majority of people in poverty and servitude. The armor, the ceremonies, the codes of conduct, all of it was just window dressing on what was essentially a protection racket. Knights offered protection from other knights, creating the very problem they claimed to solve. And the most tragic part? Many of the men who became knights were victims of this system themselves. They were taken from their families as children, brutalized into becoming killers, and then destroyed by the very lifestyle they had been trained for. The average lifespan of a knight was significantly shorter than that of a civilian, not just because of battle injuries, but because of the accumulated damage from years of violence, poor living conditions, and psychological trauma. Most knights died not in glorious battle, but from disease, infection, or accidents related to their dangerous lifestyle. They would succumb to fevers in foreign lands, fall from their horses during routine travel, or simply waste away from the cumulative effects of a lifetime of abuse. The few knights who lived to old age were typically broken men, crippled by old wounds, haunted by memories of violence, and struggling with health problems that modern medicine could easily treat. But we're still not done exploring just how nightmarish the reality of knighthood actually was. The diseases that plagued knights would make your skin crawl. We're talking about conditions so horrific that medieval chroniclers often refuse to describe them in detail. Let's start with something called knight's rot, which was essentially what happened when you spent months in armor without proper hygiene. Picture this: your skin trapped under layers of metal and leather, never able to breathe properly. Sweat, blood, and other bodily fluids creating the perfect breeding ground for bacteria and fungi. Knights would develop festering sores that ate through their flesh, creating wounds that never healed because they could never properly clean or rest the affected areas. But knight's rot was just the beginning. Dysentery was so common among knights on campaign that they had a saying: "More knights die from their bowels than from enemy blades." And they weren't exaggerating. When you're drinking contaminated water and eating spoiled food while living in conditions that would make a pig farm look sanitary, your digestive system becomes a biological weapon against yourself. The smell of a knight suffering from dysentery was so overwhelming that even hardened warriors would refuse to share quarters with them. But here's the kicker: you couldn't just take time off to recover. If you were on campaign, you fought while literally dying from the inside out because showing weakness meant abandonment by your comrades. Now let's talk about something that will really disturb you: the dental nightmare that was medieval knighthood. Knights had access to better food than peasants, which you'd think would mean better teeth. Wrong. The constant stress of combat, poor nutrition during campaigns, and complete lack of dental care created mouths that were basically infection factories. Tooth abscesses were incredibly common, and without antibiotics, these infections would spread to the jaw, then to the blood, causing agonizing deaths that could take weeks. Knights would try to continue fighting with faces swollen beyond recognition, their judgment impaired by constant pain and fever. Many knights had most of their teeth knocked out during combat, leaving them unable to eat solid food. They'd survive on liquid gruel, gradually starving even while consuming what they thought was adequate nutrition. The social humiliation of being unable to eat properly at feasts was almost as devastating as the physical consequences. But the oral infections were nothing compared to what happened when knights developed what medieval physicians called the warrior's curse. This was essentially sepsis caused by infected wounds, and it killed more knights than all the swords and arrows combined. Here's how it worked. You'd take a seemingly minor wound in battle, maybe a small cut that barely bled, but that cut had been made by a weapon that was covered in rust, blood, and who knows what other contamination. Within days, red streaks would start spreading from the wound site, heading toward your heart like a countdown to death. Knights knew that once you saw those red streaks, you had maybe a week to live. Medieval medicine had no treatment for blood poisoning, so knights would simply wait to die while their bodies slowly shut down. The fever would make them delirious. They'd lose control of their bodily functions and they'd eventually slip into a coma before death. What makes this even more horrifying is that knights often knew they were dying but had to keep fighting anyway. Military campaigns couldn't stop for individual medical emergencies, so septic knights would strap on their armor one last time and charge into battle, hoping to die quickly rather than endure the slow agony of blood poisoning. The psychological impact of watching your comrades die from infected wounds was devastating. Knights lived with the constant knowledge that any injury, no matter how minor, could be a death sentence. This created a paranoia about wounds that bordered on obsession. But there was nothing they could do to prevent infections even if they wanted to. And speaking of psychological horror, let's discuss the nightmares that plagued knights throughout their lives. Modern soldiers deal with PTSD, but they have support systems, therapy, and at least some understanding of what they're going through. Medieval knights had none of that. Knights would wake up screaming from dreams of battles they'd fought years earlier. They'd relive the moment they killed their first man, the sound of metal cutting through bone, the look in dying enemies' eyes. But medieval society saw these nightmares as either weakness or divine punishment, so knights suffered in complete isolation. Many knights developed what we'd now recognize as severe anxiety disorders. They'd become hypervigilant, unable to relax even in supposedly safe environments. A knight might spend a peaceful evening at court constantly scanning for threats, his hand never straying far from his weapon because his mind couldn't accept that he wasn't in immediate danger. The sleep deprivation caused by chronic nightmares created a vicious cycle. Exhausted knights made poor decisions in battle, leading to more traumatic experiences which led to worse nightmares. Many knights turned to alcohol or other substances to numb their minds enough to sleep, but this only created additional problems. Some knights developed what medieval chroniclers described as battle madness, where they would fly into uncontrollable rages during combat. These weren't strategic berserker tactics. They were psychological breaks where knights would attack friend and foe alike until they were killed or knocked unconscious. The social isolation that came with these psychological problems was crushing. Knights who couldn't control their symptoms were gradually excluded from their peer groups, left to deal with their trauma alone. Many ended up as hermits or joined extreme religious orders, seeking solitude because they could no longer function in society. But here's something that really shows how broken the knightly system was. The concept of honor that supposedly defined knighthood was actually a trap that prevented knights from seeking help for their problems. Admitting to fear, trauma, or mental illness was seen as dishonorable, so knights had to maintain a facade of strength even while they were falling apart inside. This created a warrior culture where showing any sign of human vulnerability was career suicide. Knights would literally rather die than admit they were struggling with the psychological aftermath of violence. The result was a class of men who were professionally required to be inhuman, The training that created knights was specifically designed to suppress empathy and emotional connection. Young boys were taught that caring about their enemies or even caring too much about their comrades would get them killed. They were systematically conditioned to view other human beings as obstacles to be removed rather than people with their own lives and feelings. This dehumanization was necessary for knights to function in combat, but it made them incapable of forming normal relationships outside of warfare. Knights struggled to connect with their wives, their children, and their communities because they had been trained to see emotional connection as weakness. Many knights' marriages were disasters because they couldn't transition between their battlefield persona and their domestic role. They'd return from campaigns psychologically damaged and expect their families to welcome them back as if nothing had happened. The disconnect between what knights thought they were and what they actually were created constant conflict in their personal lives. The children of knights often grew up terrified of their fathers, who were unpredictable, violent, and emotionally unavailable. These children would either rebel against the knightly lifestyle or become damaged themselves as they were forced into the same brutal training that had destroyed their fathers. And let's talk about the financial reality that nobody mentions in the romantic stories. Being a knight was incredibly expensive, and most knights lived in constant debt. The cost of maintaining armor, weapons, and horses was staggering, and knights often had to choose between eating and keeping their equipment in fighting condition. Many knights became essentially indentured servants to wealthier lords, fighting in exchange for basic survival rather than any noble ideals. They were trapped in a system where they couldn't afford to stop being knights, but being a knight was slowly killing them both physically and financially. The pressure to maintain their social status while barely surviving economically drove many knights to desperate measures. They'd rob merchants, extort money from peasants, or sell their services to anyone willing to pay regardless of the moral implications of their actions. Some knights turned to banditry outright, using their military training to prey on travelers and merchants. The line between knight and brigand was often paper-thin, with many men switching between the two roles depending on their current financial situation. The most successful knights weren't the most honorable. They were the most effective at extracting wealth from others. Knights who maintained their moral principles usually ended up destitute, while those who embraced corruption and violence prospered. This economic desperation created a culture where might literally made right. Knights with superior fighting skills could take whatever they wanted from those too weak to resist, and society not only tolerated this, but celebrated it as natural order. The feudal system that supposedly provided knights with land and income was actually a pyramid scheme where only those at the very top benefited. Most knights received just enough resources to stay alive and functional, while the real wealth flowed upward to the major lords and kings. But we haven't even gotten to the most disturbing part yet. What happened to knights when they could no longer fight? The retirement plan for medieval knights was essentially a death sentence with extra steps. Unlike modern soldiers who might receive pensions or veteran benefits, knights who became too old, injured, or sick to fight were simply discarded by the system that had used them up. Picture this. You're a 40-year-old knight, which in medieval terms made you practically ancient. Your joints are destroyed from years of fighting in heavy armor. You've got permanent nerve damage from multiple head injuries, and your sword arm shakes so badly you can't hold a weapon steady. What happens next? Absolutely nothing. No support, no assistance, no acknowledgement of your decades of service. Most retired knights ended up begging in the streets, trading on their former status to get scraps from people who had once feared them. The same society that had celebrated their violence when they were useful now saw them as embarrassing reminders of the cost of warfare. Some knights tried to become instructors, teaching younger men the skills that had destroyed their own bodies. But even this was a cruel joke, because the rapid evolution of military technology meant that their hard-won expertise was often obsolete within a generation. The lucky few who had managed to accumulate some wealth during their fighting years might retire to small holdings, but even they faced a grim reality. They were warriors trying to become farmers with no knowledge of agriculture and bodies too damaged for physical labor. Many former knights developed what we'd now recognize as chronic pain conditions. Years of impacts, falls, and weapon strikes had created permanent damage to their spines, joints, and internal organs. They lived in constant agony with no effective pain relief except alcohol, which only created additional problems. The psychological adjustment from being a feared warrior to being a powerless old man was devastating. Knights who had defined themselves entirely through violence and combat prowess suddenly had no identity or purpose. Many fell into deep depressions that lasted until their deaths. But here's where it gets really dark. Some knights couldn't accept their diminished status and would seek out increasingly dangerous situations to prove they were still capable warriors. They'd pick fights with younger knights, volunteer for suicide missions, or simply walk into battles they knew they couldn't survive. Others became bitter and resentful, spending their final years telling anyone who would listen about how much better things were in their day. They'd complain about the decline of honor and chivalry while conveniently forgetting that they had participated in the same brutal system they now criticized. The few knights who lived long enough to see their sons enter the profession often experienced profound regret. They watched their children go through the same traumatic training they had endured, knowing exactly what kind of psychological and physical damage awaited them. Some tried to discourage their sons from pursuing knighthood, but the social expectations were too strong. Refusing to become a knight meant social exile for noble families. So fathers were forced to send their children into the same meat grinder that had destroyed them. The relationship between aging knights and their adult children was often strained beyond repair. How do you explain to your son that the glorious career you've prepared him for will slowly destroy everything human about him? How do you maintain the fiction of knightly honor when your own life is proof of its emptiness? Now let's talk about something that will really make your skin crawl. The medical complications that developed over a knight's career. We've discussed immediate battle injuries, but the long-term health effects were even more horrifying. Knights who had worn heavy armor for decades developed severe spinal deformities. Their backs would curve unnaturally from years of carrying enormous weight, creating a hunched appearance that marked them as clearly as any coat of arms. These spinal injuries caused constant pain and made simple movements excruciating. The repeated head trauma from combat created what we'd now recognize as chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Knights would develop memory problems, personality changes, and progressive cognitive decline. They'd become confused, aggressive, and unable to recognize friends and family members. Many knights developed a condition medieval physicians called warrior's palsy, which was essentially nerve damage from repeated injuries. Their hands would shake uncontrollably, their speech would slur, and they'd lose fine motor control. Simple tasks like eating or writing became impossible challenges. The respiratory problems were equally devastating. Knights who had inhaled smoke from countless fires, dust from battlefields, and their own infected breath trapped inside helmets developed chronic lung conditions that left them gasping for air with minimal exertion. And let's not forget about the digestive disasters. Years of eating spoiled food, drinking contaminated water, and dealing with constant stress had destroyed most knights' digestive systems. They'd suffer from chronic diarrhea, stomach ulcers, and malnutrition even when food was plentiful. But perhaps the most tragic medical reality was how these conditions interacted with each other. A knight with respiratory problems couldn't get enough oxygen to heal from other injuries. Digestive issues prevented proper nutrition, making all other health problems worse. It was a cascade of medical failures that medieval medicine was powerless to address. The pain management options available to knights were essentially non-existent. They might chew on willow bark for minor aches, but serious chronic pain was just something they had to endure. Many knights spent their final years in constant agony, counting down the days until death would finally provide relief. Some knights turned to extreme religious practices, believing that their suffering was divine punishment for their violent lives. They joined flagellant movements or extreme monastic orders, adding self-inflicted pain to their existing medical problems in hopes of achieving spiritual redemption. Others became obsessed with finding miracle cures, spending their remaining wealth on quack remedies and fake healers. They'd try everything from drinking mercury to sleeping with crystals, growing more desperate as their conditions worsened. The social stigma around medical problems made everything worse. Knights were expected to suffer in silence, never complaining about pain or disability. Showing weakness was seen as dishonorable, so knights had to pretend they were fine even while their bodies were falling apart. This created a culture where knights would literally work themselves to death rather than admit they needed help. They'd continue trying to perform their duties long after they were physically capable, often making their conditions worse through sheer stubborn pride. The families of sick knights often faced financial ruin. Medical treatments, even ineffective ones, were expensive. Caring for a disabled knight required resources that most families didn't have. Many knights' wives were forced to sell everything just to keep their husbands alive for a few more months. But here's something that really drives home how disposable knights were in this system. When a knight became too sick or injured to fight, his lord would often simply stop providing support. The same man who had risked his life for his liege would be abandoned the moment he became a liability rather than an asset. Libu. The legal system offered no protection for disabled knights. They had no rights, no guarantees, no safety net. If they couldn't fight, they were essentially non-persons in the eyes of medieval law. Some knights tried to transition into other roles within the feudal system, becoming administrators or advisors. But most lacked the education or social skills necessary for these positions. They were trained killers trying to become bureaucrats, and the transition rarely went well. The few knights who successfully made this transition often found themselves despised by both their former warrior comrades and their new civilian colleagues. They belonged to neither world fully, existing in a lonely middle ground where they were trusted by no one. And let's talk about the sexual dysfunction that plagued many knights throughout their careers. Years of trauma, both physical and psychological, often left knights unable to maintain normal, intimate relationships. The same training that made them effective killers also made them incapable of the vulnerability required for genuine intimacy. Many knights' marriages were essentially business arrangements where both parties went through the motions of domestic life while maintaining emotional distance. The knight couldn't risk the emotional connection that might interfere with his ability to kill. And his wife learned not to expect genuine affection from a man trained to suppress all human feeling. The children of these marriages often grew up in households where love was rare and violence was normalized. They'd witness their father's unpredictable rages, their mother's quiet desperation, and they'd learn that this was what adult relationships looked like. Some knights turned to prostitutes or extramarital affairs, seeking physical release without emotional connection. But even these relationships were often marked by violence and dysfunction as knights struggled to separate their battlefield persona from their private lives. The psychological damage from years of violence and trauma often manifested as sexual aggression or complete sexual withdrawal. Knights might become predatory, using their social status to coerce unwilling partners, or they might become completely celibate, unable to tolerate any kind of physical intimacy. But we're still not at the bottom of this rabbit hole. The most disturbing aspect of knighthood wasn't the violence, the disease, or even the psychological trauma. It was how the system perpetuated itself by convincing each new generation that their suffering was noble and necessary. The myths and stories that surrounded knighthood served a specific purpose. They made the brutal reality seem worthwhile. Young boys were told tales of heroic knights saving kingdoms and winning glory. But they weren't told about the dysentery, the infected wounds, or the slow psychological disintegration that awaited them. The church played a crucial role in maintaining these myths, blessing the weapons that would destroy young men's bodies and souls, while promising spiritual rewards for earthly suffering. They created a theological framework that made violence seem not just acceptable but holy. The literature of the time reinforced these myths with stories of perfect knights who embodied impossible ideals. These tales served as propaganda, convincing each new generation to sacrifice themselves for a system that would ultimately destroy them. The most successful propaganda wasn't the obvious heroic stories, but the subtle reinforcement of knightly values in everyday life. Children were taught that honor was more important than happiness, that duty mattered more than personal well-being, and that questioning the system was cowardice. Parents who had seen their own lives destroyed by knighthood still pushed their children into the same system because they couldn't imagine any alternative. The social pressure was so intense that refusing knighthood meant complete social exile for entire families. The economic system was designed to make knighthood seem like the only path to prosperity and status. Boys were taught that their only options were becoming knights or accepting a life of poverty and servitude. The system eliminated alternatives to ensure a steady supply of new recruits. But here's what really gets me about this whole nightmare. The men who suffered the most from this system were often its most vocal defenders. Knights who had been broken by years of violence would still insist that knighthood was glorious and necessary. This wasn't just denial or psychological self-protection. It was a survival mechanism in a world where admitting the truth about knighthood meant admitting that your entire life had been wasted on a lie. It was easier to maintain the fiction than to face the reality of what they had become. The knights who did try to speak honestly about their experiences were quickly silenced by their peers and superiors. The system couldn't tolerate truth-tellers because the truth would have destroyed the mythology that kept new recruits coming. Some knights developed elaborate philosophical justifications for their suffering, creating complex theories about honor, duty, and sacrifice that made their pain seem meaningful. These intellectual frameworks were really just sophisticated forms of self-deception. Others retreated into religious mysticism, convincing themselves that their earthly suffering was purifying their souls for heaven. They'd spend hours in prayer and meditation trying to find spiritual meaning in experiences that were fundamentally meaningless. The few knights who maintained their sanity and moral clarity throughout their careers often did so by compartmentalizing their lives so completely that they essentially became different people in different contexts. They'd be brutal killers on the battlefield and gentle fathers at home, never allowing these two identities to interact. But this compartmentalization came at its own cost. These knights lived fragmented lives where no part of their identity was complete or authentic. They were actors playing multiple roles, never able to be fully themselves in any situation. The psychological exhaustion from maintaining these multiple identities often led to complete emotional breakdown in later life. Knights who had seemed stable for decades would suddenly collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. And that brings us to the final, most disturbing truth about medieval knighthood. It was a system specifically designed to break human beings and remake them into something inhuman. Every aspect of knightly culture, from the childhood training to the codes of honor, served this single purpose. The men who emerged from this system weren't heroes or villains. They were victims of a social machine that consumed human beings and produced killers. They were as much casualties of medieval warfare as the enemies they killed on the battlefield. But the system was so effective at hiding its true nature that even today, centuries later, we still romanticize the very institution that destroyed countless lives. We've turned the victims of systematic abuse into symbols of honor and nobility. The real tragedy isn't that knights suffered and died, it's that their suffering was completely unnecessary. The system that created and destroyed them served no noble purpose, protected no innocent people, and advanced no worthy cause. It existed only to perpetuate itself and the power structures it supported. And perhaps most disturbing of all, similar systems continue to exist today in different forms, still convincing young people that their destruction serves some greater good. The machinery of knighthood may be gone, but the mechanisms it used to recruit, train, and dispose of human beings are still with us. But there's still more to this story that will shock you even further. The sexual violence that was endemic to knightly culture is something historians have largely sanitized from popular accounts, but the evidence is overwhelming and horrifying. Knights didn't just commit rape as isolated incidents during wartime. They systematically used sexual violence as a tool of control and domination throughout their careers. The training process itself normalized sexual violence from an early age. Young pages and squires were often sexually abused by older knights, and this abuse was either ignored or actively encouraged as part of toughening them up. Boys who complained or resisted were labeled weak and cast out of the system entirely. This created a culture where sexual violence was seen as a natural expression of power and dominance. Knights learned that taking what they wanted by force was not only acceptable but expected. The strong preyed on the weak, and sexual assault was just another weapon in their arsenal. During military campaigns, rape was so common that it was factored into strategic planning. Knights would specifically target areas with defenseless populations, not just for supplies and plunder, but for the sexual gratification of their troops. What we sanitize as taking provisions often included taking women and children as sex slaves. The legal system provided virtually no protection for victims of knightly sexual violence. If a knight raped a peasant woman, there was no meaningful recourse. The knight's word was automatically worth more than the victim's testimony, and the social hierarchy made prosecution essentially impossible. Even when knights raped women of noble birth, the focus was on the damage to family honor rather than the trauma inflicted on the victim. These crimes were treated as property damage against the woman's male relatives, not as violations of the woman herself. The Church's response to this epidemic of sexual violence was particularly nauseating. Rather than condemning the perpetrators, religious authorities often blamed the victims, suggesting that women who were assaulted had somehow tempted their attackers through immodest behavior or sinful thoughts. Some knights specialized in sexual torture, developing elaborate methods of prolonging their victims' suffering for their own entertainment. These techniques were shared among comrades like trade secrets, creating a subculture of sadistic expertise within the knightly class. The psychological impact on victims was devastating and long-lasting, but medieval society provided no support or recognition for trauma survivors. Women who had been assaulted were often treated as damaged goods, unmarriageable and worthless, facing social exile on top of their existing trauma. Many knights kept sex slaves captured during raids, treating human beings as portable entertainment for long campaigns. These victims were passed around among groups of knights, subjected to repeated assaults until they died from their injuries or took their own lives to escape the horror. The casual nature of this violence is perhaps what's most disturbing. Knights would rape and torture victims while discussing mundane topics like the weather or their equipment needs. The complete dehumanization of their victims allowed them to commit atrocities while maintaining normal social interactions with their peers. Some knights developed what can only be described as sexual addictions to violence, requiring increasingly extreme acts to achieve satisfaction. They would seek out victims specifically to torture and kill, turning sexual violence into a form of recreational hunting. The impact on families was devastating. Wives of knights lived in constant fear, knowing that their husbands were trained killers with no moral constraints on their behavior. Domestic violence was epidemic among knightly households, but it was considered a private family matter rather than a crime. Children growing up in these households were exposed to extreme violence from birth, creating generational cycles of trauma and abuse. Sons learned that violence was how real men expressed themselves, while daughters learned that their primary value was as sexual objects for male gratification. The normalization of sexual violence within knightly culture created a feedback loop where each generation became more brutal than the last. What started as opportunistic crimes during warfare evolved into systematic campaigns of sexual terrorism against civilian populations. But the sexual dysfunction went beyond outright violence. The same training that made knights effective killers also destroyed their capacity for healthy, intimate relationships. They couldn't distinguish between conquest and love, between dominance and affection. Many knights were completely incapable of consensual sexual relationships. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to associate sex with power and violence that they couldn't function with willing partners who expected mutual respect and consideration. This created a class of men who were simultaneously hypersexual and emotionally sterile. They pursued sexual gratification compulsively but were incapable of the emotional intimacy that makes sexual relationships meaningful and satisfying. The wives and partners of knights often developed severe psychological problems from living with men who treated them as property rather than people. Depression, anxiety, and what we'd now recognize as complex PTSD were common among women in knightly households. Some women turned to suicide as their only escape from lives of constant sexual and physical abuse. Others retreated into religious mysticism, seeking in spiritual experiences the emotional connection they couldn't find in their earthly relationships. The children produced by these dysfunctional relationships often inherited their parents' psychological damage, perpetuating cycles of violence and abuse that lasted for generations. Entire noble bloodlines were essentially factories for producing damaged human beings. Now let's examine the economic exploitation that was central to the knightly system but rarely discussed in romantic accounts. Knights weren't just warriors, they were essentially armed tax collectors who used violence to extract wealth from defenseless populations. The feudal system that supported knighthood was nothing more than organized extortion with fancy titles and ceremonies. Knights would show up at peasant villages with their weapons and armor, demanding tribute in exchange for protection from other knights doing exactly the same thing. This protection racket was so systematic that entire regions were divided up among different groups of knights, each extracting maximum wealth from their assigned territories. Peasants had no choice but to pay because resistance meant death or enslavement. The amounts demanded were often impossible to meet, forcing peasant families to choose between starvation and rebellion. Many communities were trapped in cycles of debt that lasted for generations, with each new generation born into servitude to pay for their ancestors' inability to satisfy knightly demands. Knights would deliberately create crises to justify increased exploitation. They'd provoke conflicts with neighboring lords, then demand additional resources to fund their military campaigns. The people who would suffer from these wars were the same ones forced to pay for them. The seasonal nature of medieval agriculture made this exploitation particularly cruel. Knights would time their demands to coincide with harvest periods, taking the food that peasant families needed to survive the winter. This created artificial famines that killed thousands while enriching the knightly class. Some knights developed sophisticated systems of economic terrorism, using torture and murder to intimidate entire regions into compliance. They'd make public examples of families who couldn't pay, ensuring that everyone else understood the consequences of resistance. The legal system was designed to legitimize this theft by giving it the appearance of lawful taxation. Complex systems of obligations and duties were created to justify taking whatever knights wanted while making it seem like peasants owed these payments. Knights who were particularly skilled at economic exploitation became wealthy and powerful, while those who showed mercy or restraint remained poor. The system rewarded cruelty and punished compassion, creating incentives for increasingly brutal behavior. The Church played a crucial role in legitimizing this economic terrorism by providing religious justification for the feudal hierarchy. They taught that social inequality was divinely ordained and that resisting knightly authority was sinful rebellion against God's will. But the exploitation went beyond simple theft. Knights would often force peasant families into debt slavery, creating obligations that could never be repaid. Entire bloodlines would be bound to serve knightly households for generations, with children inheriting their parents' unpayable debts. Women and children were particularly vulnerable to economic exploitation. Knights would demand sexual access to peasant women as part of their tribute, turning rape into a form of taxation. Children would be taken as servants or forced into military service to pay off family debts. The psychological impact of this constant economic terrorism was devastating. Peasant communities lived in perpetual fear, never knowing when knights might arrive to demand tribute they couldn't afford. This chronic stress created widespread mental health problems that affected entire populations. Some communities tried to resist by banding together and refusing to pay tribute, but these rebellions were brutally suppressed. Knights would massacre entire villages as examples to others, turning resistance into collective suicide. The few peasants who managed to accumulate any wealth had to hide it carefully, because displaying prosperity would only invite increased demands from local knights. Success became dangerous, creating incentives for deliberate poverty and stagnation. This economic system was so destructive that it actively prevented technological and social progress. Why invest in improvements when the benefits would only be stolen by knights? Why innovate when success would only make you a target for exploitation? The long-term consequences of this economic terrorism were catastrophic for European development. Entire regions remained trapped in poverty for centuries because the knightly class extracted all surplus wealth before it could be reinvested in productive activities. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of this economic exploitation was how it corrupted the knights themselves, men who started their careers believing in honor and service, gradually became nothing more than sophisticated thieves, justifying their crimes through increasingly elaborate rationalizations. The constant need to extract wealth from unwilling populations created a class of people who were skilled only in violence and intimidation. Knights became incapable of productive work, parasitic on the communities they claimed to protect. This economic dependency made knights increasingly desperate and brutal as their costs rose and their resources dwindled. They were trapped in a system that required them to become more exploitative over time just to maintain their standard of living. The competition between different groups of knights for limited resources created constant warfare and instability. Rather than cooperating for mutual benefit, knights fought endless battles over who got to exploit which populations, destroying the very wealth they were trying to capture. And here's where the economic reality of knighthood reveals its ultimate absurdity. The system was so inefficient and destructive that it impoverished everyone involved, including the knights themselves. Even the most successful knights lived precarious lives, always one bad harvest or military defeat away from financial ruin. The vast majority of knights died poor, their families left with nothing but debts and the social obligation to continue the same destructive cycle. The system consumed its own participants as ruthlessly as it consumed its victims. But there's an even darker layer to this economic exploitation that reveals the true moral bankruptcy of the knightly system. Knights didn't just steal money and goods, they stole futures, dreams, and human potential on an industrial scale. Every peasant child forced into servitude to pay family debts was a life destroyed before it could begin. Every innovative farmer whose improvements were confiscated had his contributions to human progress stolen. Every community terrorized into submission lost the social cohesion necessary for cultural and technological advancement. The knights weren't just taking wealth, they were systematically destroying the conditions that create wealth in the first place. They were eating the seed corn of human civilization, consuming the future to fund their present lifestyle. This destruction of human potential was so vast in scope that we can barely comprehend its impact. How many potential scientists, artists, inventors, and leaders were never able to develop their talents because they were trapped in systems of knightly exploitation. How much human progress was lost to fund the violent fantasies of a warrior class. The irony is that knights claim to be protecting civilization while systematically destroying the foundations that make civilization possible. They were antibodies attacking the very organism they claim to defend, and the most tragic part is that this destruction was completely unnecessary. The resources consumed by the knightly system could have funded genuine improvements in agriculture, technology, education, and infrastructure that would have benefited everyone, including the knights themselves. But the system was incapable of reform because it was based on fundamental contradictions. Knights couldn't maintain their social status without violence and exploitation, but violence and exploitation ultimately destroyed the wealth they were trying to capture. This created a downward spiral where knights had to become increasingly brutal and extractive just to maintain their lifestyle, which destroyed more wealth, which required even more brutality to extract the resources they needed. The system was literally eating itself alive. The end result was a society trapped in permanent stagnation, where human energy was consumed by endless cycles of violence and exploitation rather than being channeled into productive activities that could improve everyone's lives. But we're still not done peeling back the layers of this nightmare. The environmental destruction caused by knightly warfare and the feudal system represents another dimension of devastation that historians rarely discuss in detail. Medieval warfare wasn't just about battles between armies. It was systematic environmental terrorism designed to destroy entire regions' capacity to support human life. Knights would deliberately target agricultural infrastructure, burning crops, poisoning wells, and salting fields to deny resources to their enemies. This scorched earth strategy created artificial famines that killed far more people than direct combat ever did. Entire populations would starve to death while knights fought over the ruins of once productive landscapes. The environmental damage from a single military campaign could take decades to repair, assuming the region ever recovered at all. Some areas of Europe remained depopulated wastelands for generations after being targeted by knightly armies. Knights would also deliberately slaughter livestock, not for food but to deny their enemies access to milk, eggs, and draft animals. This destroyed the foundation of agricultural life and made recovery even more difficult for surviving populations. The constant warfare created by knightly competition prevented long-term environmental stewardship. Why plant trees for future generations when enemy knights might burn them down next year? Why invest in soil improvement when your fields might be salted by invading armies? Forests were systematically destroyed to fuel the massive demand for charcoal needed to produce weapons and armor. Entire woodland ecosystems were consumed to create the tools of knightly warfare, leaving barren landscapes that took centuries to recover. The mining operations needed to produce metal for armor and weapons created environmental disasters that poisoned water supplies and destroyed agricultural land. The true cost of a knight's equipment included the long-term degradation of entire watersheds. Rivers and streams were contaminated by the runoff from armor production, creating dead zones where nothing could live. Fish populations collapsed, agriculture became impossible, and communities that had depended on these water sources for generations were forced to abandon their homes. The environmental impact of maintaining war horses was also devastating. These animals required enormous amounts of grain and hay, creating pressure on agricultural systems that were already strained by human demands and knightly exploitation. When knights traveled with their retinues, they would strip entire regions of food and fodder, leaving ecological devastation in their wake. A single knightly army could consume the resources of dozens of communities, creating famines that lasted for years. The cumulative environmental damage from centuries of knightly warfare contributed to climate instability and agricultural collapse across Europe. The little ice age that devastated medieval Europe was partly caused by the deforestation and soil degradation resulting from constant military campaigns. But the environmental destruction wasn't just a side effect of knightly activities. It was often a deliberate strategy. Knights understood that controlling resources meant controlling people, so they would systematically destroy the environmental foundations of enemy territories. This environmental warfare created refugee crises as displaced populations fled devastated regions in search of food and shelter. These refugees often became brigands themselves, creating cycles of violence and environmental destruction that spread across entire continents. The long-term consequences of this environmental terrorism are still visible today in the form of degraded landscapes, depleted soils, and ecological systems that never fully recovered from medieval destruction. And here's what makes this environmental devastation particularly tragic. Much of it was completely pointless. Knights would destroy productive landscapes to gain temporary tactical advantages in conflicts that ultimately resolved nothing and benefited no one. The environmental knowledge that was lost during this period represents another catastrophic cost of the knightly system. Generations of accumulated wisdom about sustainable agriculture, forest management, and ecological stewardship were destroyed along with the communities that maintained this knowledge. Local varieties of crops and livestock that had been developed over centuries were lost forever when knights destroyed the communities that maintained them. This genetic heritage could never be recovered, representing permanent losses to human agricultural potential. The traditional ecological knowledge held by peasant communities was systematically destroyed as these communities were displaced, enslaved, or murdered by knightly armies. This knowledge had taken centuries to develop, and could have contributed to more sustainable and productive agricultural systems. Instead of building on this accumulated wisdom, the knightly system destroyed it in favor of short-term extraction and exploitation. They chose immediate gratification over long-term sustainability, leaving future generations to deal with the consequences of their environmental crimes. The irony is that knights ultimately destroyed the very foundations of the wealth and power they were trying to secure. By devastating the environmental systems that supported human civilization, they undermined their own long-term interests while causing immeasurable suffering to everyone else. This environmental destruction represents perhaps the most damning indictment of the knightly system. It wasn't just harmful to human beings, it was actively destructive to the natural world that sustains all life. Knights were literally at war with the planet itself. But even this catalog of horrors doesn't capture the full scope of what made knighthood such a nightmarish institution. There's still one more layer of this story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about medieval honor and nobility.